Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're located. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of R2V3. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Program Manager with PJR. I have a brief agenda on the screen here. We'll start off talking a little bit about PJR, who we are, what we do. We'll cover some of the benefits of certification to a standard like R2V3. We'll highlight the transition details, cover some of the key changes, including the revisions between R2 2013 and R2V3, as well as some other related changes affecting clients getting ready to transition. We'll also cover a summary of the certification process. So for any clients who are pursuing initial certification, we'll cover what that process looks like as well. We'll hold any questions until the end, but we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. You can type those into the chat field at any time. We will have a recording of today's webinar made available on PGR's website in the near future, as well as a copy of the slides available for download. Perry Johnson Registrars is one of the leading registrars. We have certified clients around the globe. This list of countries in which we've certified clients is not all-inclusive, but certainly gives an idea of our global presence. And as I mentioned, we offer certifications to a wide variety of standards. This list gives you an idea of what some of those standards include. Today, the subject of the webinar is R2V3. PGR has achieved accreditation to conduct audits and issue certificates to R2V3. Benefits of certification vary widely by industry, by standard, even by area. But in general, some of the most common benefits of certification to R2 include that commitment to responsibly reusing and recycling both electronics and electronic components. Maintaining the standard certification drives improvements to the organization's environmental, health, and safety performance. The standard represents a framework for meeting customer as well as regulatory requirements to which the facility may be subject. The standard also drives improvements or increases to management commitment and employee engagement levels. Maintaining R2 certification can provide a competitive advantage over, say, competitors bidding for the same job. If they don't hold that same certification, that may provide an advantage to your organization. Maintaining the certification can also improve public image. Again, that commitment to responsible recycling and reuse of those electronics can go a long way. In addition to that competitive advantage and that improved public image we just spoke about, there could be other financial benefits as well in some areas depending on the standard. For example, insurance carriers may offer lower premiums. Maintaining a standard certification like R2 helps achieve strategic objectives that the organization may have or associated stakeholder requirements. The standard allows for integration with other business management systems, which is another benefit. I want to start by highlighting the transition expectations. There is continued confusion in this area. As with any transition, there is feelings of trepidation for what the standard changes may include or how much work may be involved in transitioning the management system for clients who are currently certified to R2 2013 and are preparing their management system to transition to R2V3. I can tell you that the R2V3 standard was published in 2020. You can get a copy from the CIRI website. The rec is something that we'll talk about when we get into the details of those actual changes, but that can also be found on CIRI's website. The transition plan itself, issued by SERI, is found in Advisory 22. There was also a revision to the Code of Practices, which can be found in the SERI website's document library. SERI is maintaining their website knowledge base in lieu of a formal guidance document. They maintained a guidance document to the R2 2013 standard. However, with all the subsequent changes, they have instead opted to utilize the Code of Practices in conjunction with the knowledge base. You can check out the knowledge base on the SERI website. It's got a lot of articles, Q&As, videos, training material. There's really a lot of information on there. So we'll get back to the contents of the transition plan in just a moment. Again, that's found in Advisory 22. And training for R2V3 is being made available on a continual basis by SERI as well, whether for trained auditors to upgrade from R2 2013 to R2V3 or for new auditors as well. This is a helpful resource for facilities and consultants as well. Those trainings are not limited to certification body auditors. If you'd like to have internal auditors go through the course to understand the requirements or meet certain training competency criteria, that's an option as well. So I mentioned that the Advisory 22 houses the transition plan as issued by SERI. Per the original transition requirements, the R2V3 transition audits had to be at least 50% on site. With COVID, we're seeing a lot of audits go virtually or a lot of requests for audits to go virtually. Not all clients, not all management systems are eligible for virtual audits or fully virtual audits. Not all scopes and facilities are compatible with fully virtual audits to ensure the effectiveness and integrity of those audits. So this is something that, especially for our two clients, we review on a case-by-case basis. Again, the original requirements for the transition audits were that the maximum amount of time allowed to go virtually for those audits, assuming the client was a good candidate, would be 50%. Very recently, Advisory 24 was released by SERI, which allows for the potential for a transition audit to go fully virtually. With this comes several additional requirements, as well as the need for the auditor conducting the audit to have completed special training with SERI to the requirements of Advisory 24. I'm not going to speak in more detail about that option during this webinar. We're going to focus on the changes between R2 2013 and R2V3, but now that Advisory 24 has been published, I did want to amend these slides to update the potential for an audit, a transition audit, to be completely virtual in certain circumstances. Advisory 22 staggers the transition timeline in order to give facilities time to plan. It also attempts to avoid overloading CBs with too high a volume of facilities transitioning at once. We'll talk a little bit more about that staggered timeline on the next slide. I mentioned already that PJR is accredited to R2V3, which means that not only can we be conducting audits to the standard, we can issue accredited certificates to them once the audit is closed, the package is reviewed by the technical committee in-house, and a certificate draft is approved by the client. PJR issued its own transition plan after SERI's Advisory 22 was issued, and you can find a copy of this on our website. As with many previous standard transitions, PJR included an internal deadline recommendation by which transition audits should occur. This is how we will attempt to avoid lapses in certification due to having your transition audit too close to the overall deadline to transition. And we'll talk more about those dates on the next slide. So again, we have the deadline in Advisory 22 for the transition audits to be completed and certificates to be transitioned. And PJR has its own internal deadline a couple of months prior to the overall deadline to avoid lapses in certification. Before we can issue a revised certificate, the audit needs to be completed, any NCRs need to be closed, the package needs to be reviewed by a technical committee member, and then the certificate draft needs to be drafted and approved by the client, all before a final certificate can be issued. So all of those internal certification decision-making activities take place after the audit concludes and need to be accomplished before a certificate is issued. So the overall transition deadline is inclusive of all of those activities. If we have an audit scheduled too close to the deadline, we may not be able to meet those expectations without a lapse in certification, meaning that revised certificate or that new certificate may not be issued before the transition deadline. That is the deadline, that is the expiration for all R2 2013 certificates that are still in existence at that time. So post expiration, while you're waiting for that revised certificate, you will not actively be certified. You'll be in a state of certification lapse where your certificate is not valid and you're unable to advertise that R2 certification. So what some of this information is intended to do is to help facilities plan their transitions in advance to avoid a situation where the audit is scheduled too close to the deadline and a certification lapse occurs. Most clients should plan to transition in 2022 if they're able. This will avoid, again, having your audit too close to that overall expiration date, as well as a bottleneck for our CB resources, for having enough auditors to staff the transition audits should the majority of our clients hope to transition in that first quarter of 2023. So if you haven't already scheduled your 2022 R2 audit for existing clients, I suggest you consider transitioning in advance of that audit and having your 2022 audit constitute your transition audit if you can be reasonably prepared to do so. You do have time after the audit to close any NCRs, so should you have some findings at your audit, as always, you have that time to work through the findings through the corrective action process to resolve them and close those NCRs. We'll talk more about the corrective action deadlines later in the presentation. So I mentioned that Advisory 22 staggers the transition expectations. What I mean by that is they set different expectations based on the R2 2013 certificate expiration date. So the expiration date of the R2 2013 certificate dictates how a company is required to transition. Originally, we had the first bullet point where we had a deadline to stop offering initial registrations to R2 2013. That deadline has already passed. We are no longer offering initial registrations to R2 2013, meaning you can't have a stage 1 and stage 2 audit to R2 2013. You can't get a new facility certificate to R2 2013. All new initial registration audits are conducted to R2V3 at this time. The next bullet point has also passed. It allowed for facilities with R2 2013 certificates expiring in 2021 to recertify to R2 2013 one more time. It required that the audit be completed before the end of the calendar year 2021, which it would have had to have done with an expiration date on or before December 31st of 2021 anyway. And then it required the new R2 2013 certificate to expire early in agreement with the Advisory 22 overall transition deadline. So if you recertified one more time to R2 2013 in the calendar year 2021, you did not get the full 3 years on that R2 2013 certificate, and it reflects an expiration date of June 30th, 2023. June 30th, 2023 is the overall transition deadline for R2 2013 clients. This is when any remaining R2 2013 certificates will be withdrawn. The final bullet point is where we find ourselves now. So looking at the second bullet point, for clients who had a R2 2013 certificate expiring on or before December 31st of 2021, they were allowed to recertify to R2 2013 one more time. That leaves everyone else. So if your R2 2013 certificate expires in 2022, you'll be transitioning during your recertification audit in 2022, since we can't offer initial certifications to R2 2013 and we can't recertify to R2 2013 now that that December 31st, 2021 deadline has passed. Again, this was not based on audit dates, but certificate expiration. So in Advisory 22, you find a category for facilities with certificates expiring in 2021, and then you find a category for certificates expiring after that December 2021 deadline. So if your certificate for R2 2013 expires any date after January 1st, 2022, you must transition at your recertification audit. If your certificate doesn't expire until 2023, you have the choice between transitioning during your 2022 audit, which admittedly may not be a recertification audit depending on the exact date of expiration and when in the calendar year you're due for your audit, or to transition in 2023, again, depending on those audit dates. As I mentioned on the last slide, we do encourage clients to transition in 2022 to avoid resource strains with auditor availability, to avoid potential lapses in certifications, things like that. The third bullet point discusses how audit time is calculated for the transition audits. Clients are allowed to transition to R2V3 during any audit type within their cycle. So if you have a annual surveillance 2 scheduled for 2022 and you decide that you want to transition in 2022, that is perfectly acceptable. It would no longer be considered an annual surveillance 2 for the R2 standard. That would become your transition audit. Transition audit time is equivalent to the stage 1 and stage 2 time for R2V3 per the Code of Practice requirements, because this allows for all of the core requirements and any applicable process requirements in R2V3 to be fully audited as part of that transition audit. So that first R2V3 audit, that transition audit, represents auditing of all the applicable requirements. So we calculate audit time per the Code of Practice. It's the stage 1 and stage 2 time combined. So your transition audit, whether you're having it at your annual surveillance 2 or your recertification audit, that will be how we calculate the transition time. It does restart the 3-year certification cycle for the R2 standard. If you are transitioning at a recert in your cycle, then that doesn't change anything. If you have an integrated management system and you have RIO certification, or you have, for example, ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, if they're already recertification audits, that won't change anything. If you are transitioning to R2V3 during an annual surveillance audit, the R2 audit will be changed to the transition, calculated as a recert time, and then your other standards, if you, again, if you have an integrated audit, will be out of sync, and that's something that we could address if you'd like to synchronize them again. I mentioned earlier the overall deadline to transition per Advisory 22 is June 30th, 2023. This is when any remaining R2 2013 certificates will be withdrawn. And if you've gone through the process of having your transition audit and the certificate has not been issued yet, You will have a lapse in certification until that final certificate is issued. So keep that in mind when you're scheduling your audits, when you're planning your transition, to allow enough time for closure of any NCRs, the technical package review that PGR does, the certificate draft issuance and review process. All of those behind the scenes activities need to take place before the overall deadline to prevent a lapse in certification. I put some of the same information in a timeline. Sometimes a graphical representation or a visual representation is more helpful. So the R2 2013 standard was revised for a number of reasons. This is not where I want to spend the majority of our time today. We can assume some reasons for transitioning standards or revising standards are fairly similar across the different types of standards, such as ensuring they continue to be relevant to the applicable markets, they continue to be compatible with other standards, that they're easy to use, easy to translate, free of ambiguity. Other reasons in the case of R2 2013 include taking into account series lessons learned, feedback from the TAC or the Technical Advisory Committee, taking into consideration public comments, including those from customers, auditors, certification bodies like PJR, and a whole host of other formats. The standard was revised to continue to reflect the diversity of the industry, to reinforce effective implementation of the requirements of the standard, and to ensure that the intent of the standard is achieved. It's really hard to achieve the intent of this standard if requirements within the standard are not consistently or effectively implemented across different clients, different certification bodies, different auditor bases. So that is one of the reasons why the standard is revised and the language is strengthened in key areas. The standard was also revised to clarify language and to clarify any potential sources of confusion, again, taking into consideration how the standard was being implemented and whether the intent of the standard was being achieved. I have a screenshot on the right-hand side of this slide. When we're starting to talk about the key changes in the standard, we can see pretty quickly, just looking at the table of contents here, that the structure of the standard has changed. Before we dive into the changes, I want to emphasize that the intent of the standard is unchanged. At the heart of it, at its core, R2 has the same purpose it has always had, to prioritize reuse over recycling, to ensure that functionality is fully tested and accurately conveyed to the end user, that due diligence is maintained for downstream vendors to ensure the R2 criteria are upheld, whether they are completed by the R2 facility themselves or sent to a downstream vendor to be processed on their behalf. The intent of the standard is the same. Looking at the table of contents, we can see that the standard has been divided into core requirements and process requirements. The process requirements are found within individual appendices, and all process requirements applicable to an R2 facility's scope must be included. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to that section in the standard. The core requirements, on the other hand, will apply to all R2 facilities. R2V3 has a greater emphasis on reuse, with more prescriptive requirements in certain areas, including data security, testing, and repair. It includes clarification of requirements which were not understood or may have been ineffectively implemented. There are changes to the order, grouping, and number of provisions. We had 13 provisions in R2 2013, and now we see 10 core requirements in that first section, that core requirements section. Another key change in R2V3 is the creation of the REC, or the R2 Equipment Categorization document. We'll talk some more about that later as well. Another key change in R2V3 is the requirement for a certified quality management system, QMS, for certain process requirements. This means that in addition to the R2 2013 prerequisites, which included certified EHS standards, commonly either RIOS or ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, some clients will actually now also be required to maintain a certified QMS, such as ISO 9001. RIOS satisfies this requirement as well, being that it is a quality, environmental, and health and safety standard. There are a couple of other standards that would fulfill this requirement as well, found on the CIRI website. Depending on the process requirements applicable given the facility's scope, again, process requirements or appendices, you could call them, depending on which appendices apply given the R2 facility scope, a certified QMS may also be required. If you're transitioning from R2 2013 to R2V3, depending on your scope, if you're conducting those testing activities, if you are fulfilling those requirements found in Appendix C before selling to an end user, for example, you will be required to add a certified QMS to fulfill the R2V3 requirements. That's just one example. There are a handful of appendices that require a certified QMS, and this is something that we work through as part of the transition process. We're going to go section by section in the standard, but I'm only going to spend time on areas where there are key changes. Again, a copy of the slides will be available on PGR's website for you to review in more detail, and a copy of the standard can be accessed through CIRI's website for you to learn more and review the requirements in more detail on your own. No significant changes in the introduction section, with the exception of references to the REC. The intent of the REC, or the R2 Equipment Categorization document, which can be downloaded from CIRI's website, is the requirement to use the REC in conjunction with the standard. It provides an outline of requirements for evaluating electronic equipment and components, as well as categorizing them based on their condition, which includes cosmetic condition, functionality, data sanitization status, and a few other things. The categories identified in the REC either need to be incorporated directly into the facility's processes and procedures or be utilized through a cross-reference. So if you're not utilizing the REC's exact categories, you need to be able to demonstrate to an auditor how your categories directly correlate to those required by the REC. No significant changes to the R2 certification section, although it does impact the requirements for a certification body as to what needs to be included on the certificate. There are a whole host of new and/or revised definitions. I encourage you to take time to review those to be able to better understand the requirements of the standard and recognize some of that terminology, such as R2 controlled streams or unrestricted streams, to be able to dictate the flow for material as it's inbound or throughout the various processes, to be able to ensure it's being processed through the correct pathway. Some of this terminology is going to be especially important. Corp Requirement 1 covers scope. It includes specifications for all the things that the audits need to include and everything that the certificate needs to include. Again, some of those requirements are more for the certification body, but it's helpful for R2 facilities to understand where these requirements come from to ensure, for example, that all processes and activities under the control of the R2 facility are included in audits, even if they're conducted externally. I mentioned already that all the core requirements will apply to R2 facilities, to all R2 facilities. So all 10 of those core requirements will be audited for all clients, and then any applicable process requirements will also be audited. This is based on the scope of activities, what processes the R2 facility actually conducts. This is not a pick and choose what you'd like on your certificate kind of situation, as much as it is if you do X, you need Y. So PGR assists in that process going through the transition, and we'll talk some more about that later on as well. I mentioned there's requirements as to what needs to be included in the certificate itself. One key aspect of that is making sure that all applicable legal names and legal entities associated with those certifiable activities are included. Again, that's an activity that PJR will dig into and assist with as well. A new requirement in R2V3 is that the R2 facility publicly communicate a current and ongoing list of all locations that are not certified to R2, that are owned and or operated by the R2 facility, and are used to manage used or end-of-life electronic equipment, components, or materials. So this requirement was less stringent in R2 2013, requiring that the advertising be very clear so as not to mislead the general public for the status of certification. This, on the other hand, is requiring that all the locations be clearly communicated when they are not certified, so there is even less room for ambiguity. R2V3 doesn't allow companies who've been identified by Siri within the last 2 years to have marketed or advertised fraudulently or deceptively, participated in illegal activities, etc., to be eligible for certification. So if that's something that your organization has encountered in the past, it will prevent you from pursuing R2V3 certification for a period of at least 2 years. No significant changes. Core Requirement 2 covers the hierarchy of responsible management strategies, and again, the main goal of the R2V3 standard is still to ensure reuse is prioritized wherever possible. Core Requirement 3 covers the EH&S management system requirements. I mentioned already that those prerequisite standards, excluding appendices that may require a certified QMS, which we'll revisit later. The general R2V3 prerequisite criteria are a certified EH&S management system. This can be satisfied with either ISO 14001 and ISO 45001, or the RIO standard, which includes quality, environmental health, and safety requirements. Core Requirement 3 also requires a process to periodically evaluate exposures to hazardous substances. So examples may include mercury, lead, beryllium, cadmium, PCBs, the list goes on, depending on the types of material processed at the facility. Industrial hygiene monitoring program requirements for high-risk activities above and beyond the sort of typical requirements might be applicable in cases of activities such as materials recovery, again, dependent on the processing going on at the R2 facility. This section specifies minimum accommodations and requirements for workers, such as sanitary facilities, and controls to prevent consumption of food or drinks in areas that are not kept contaminant-free. Core Requirement 4 houses the legal and other requirements. There are requirements to document the applicable legal requirements. That's not new. That's where we see some of those similar requirements in R2 2013 as well. What legal requirements apply, inclusive of export, transit, and or import requirements to demonstrate that those shipments are in fact legal. This applies, however, in R2V3, both to equipment or components transferred directly by the R2 facility, as well as those R2 controlled streams, including shipments made by downstream vendors within that recycling chain to final disposition. So whether the export is being directed by the R2 facility or a downstream vendor, it is still part of the R2 controlled stream, and it is still required to have evidence sampled to demonstrate legality of those shipments. Core Requirement 4 also requires prompt corrective action to address any compliance violations, and it requires R2 facilities notify their certification body of receipt of notices of violation that require action or follow-up within 30 days. Child enforced labor is prohibited. Prison labor is also prohibited unless specified criteria are met, and Core Requirement 4 also houses a non-discrimination policy expectation. Core Requirement 5 covers tracking throughput. It requires a summary report be maintained for all inbound and outbound transactions. The record contents are also specified. They need to contain accurate dates, detailed descriptions, etc. for all of those inbound and outbound materials. It's important to note that any inventory level requirements, such as the R2 facilities closure plan or applicable legal requirements, also need to be adhered to when identifying inventory level controls. R2V3 does not allow R2 controlled streams or materials with negative value to be stored for more than 1 year. They need to be processed within a year. And the exceptions are listed in the standard and on this slide. Exceptions may include items that have been evaluated and inventoried per Appendix C for test and repair, or if the 1-year storage limit has been exceeded due to awaiting export approval in instances where the required applications or paperwork were submitted to the governing authority within the appropriate time frame and you're waiting for a response. Core Requirement 6 covers sorting, categorization, and processing. This section is significantly restructured compared to R2 2013. There are a lot of references to the REC in this section as well. Core Requirement 6 requires a documented process for the evaluation, sorting, and categorization of controlled and processed materials, and the subjects are prescriptive. All materials are to be managed and further processed as an R2 controlled stream per the R2V3 requirements, unless it's already been processed by an R2V3 facility. It's been processed and categorized by a non-R2V3 facility, and there is a sampling and verification process to confirm those categorizations are correct. If there are test and verification records to corroborate every functionality, to be able to identify the category that would be most applicable, or it ceases to be an R2 controlled stream. Again, these requirements are detailed in Core Requirement 6. All facilities are required to adhere to all of the core requirements. It's the appendices that will vary by scope and processes. So that means that all companies, whether they see items with reuse potential typically or not, need to at least have protocols in place to meet the core requirement expectations so that material that is inbound can be sorted and directed for processing appropriate to their condition, functionality, reuse potential, etc. All equipment and components are to be evaluated for data with their corresponding status identified per the REC. I mentioned earlier that some of the categories in the REC relate to data sanitization status. Could they potentially contain data? have they been cleared of data with associated records as evidence to be able to, again, direct the processing of that material as appropriate. R2V3 makes an assumption without the corroborating the corroborating sanitization status records that anything that could be containing data does contain data, so that there are no data security breaches. If we don't know it has been sanitized effectively, we treat it as still requiring that sanitization activity. If it's a media that could potentially bear data, if it's an electronic component that could not contain data, that would be categorized and processed in a completely different manner. Data evaluations are to include any connected user accounts and services. This again is more specific than R2 2013. I mentioned that any material that could contain data is treated as if it does until we know that it does not. This includes controlling those equipment or components per Core Requirement 7 requirements, which we'll speak to in a slide or two. If material, equipment, or components can't be reused, sold, or donated because of a written agreement in place, they would still be subject to the requirements of Core Requirement 7, as well as Appendix E, which addresses materials recovery. So for example, if a hard drive is not able to be sanitized, tested, and resold, it needs to be physically destroyed. It would go through Core Requirement 7 and ultimately processed through Appendix E, whether at the R2 facility or through a downstream vendor. There are specific requirements for categorization of unrestricted streams. Again, you'll want to get familiar with these terms in R2V3. We've talked about R2 controlled streams already. Now we're seeing unrestricted streams. So they are handled separately from R2 controlled streams, and we need to have a justification for classifying them that way and being able to track those effectively. So you need to understand the difference in those terms, and if this is something that applies to your organization, have these controls in place for classifying them, for separating them, and for tracking them. If you're transferring functioning products, equipment, or components that have demonstrated functionality per the rec, there are additional specific requirements. The categories such as functionality, data sanitization status, and cosmetic condition need to be detailed and identified for the buyer. They need unique identifiers, verification of shipment legality, packaging requirements that meet Core Requirement 10, and a return policy that meets requirements in Appendix C. Physical labels are not necessarily required. You can also use other means such as barcodes to ensure effective identification and tracking. There are not significant changes to the expectations of collectible and specialty electronics requirements. We see a 1% rule in Core Requirement 6, and we'll cover those again in Appendix D should your R2 facilities processes exceed the 1% rule for specialty electronics. Core Requirement 7 covers data security. It requires a data sanitization plan be maintained with prescribed subject matter to be included in those procedures. Again, all of the core requirements apply to all of the R2V3 facilities. So if you don't intend to process material with data, you still need to meet the requirements of Core Requirement 7, including having a data sanitization plan. These core requirements are not specific to the processes and activities and types of electronics received as the appendices are. Examples of what you might find in the data sanitization plan section, again, You'll have a copy of these slides. You can get a copy of the standard, but just to briefly cover a few, declaring secured areas dedicated to data sanitization and limiting access to those areas to only authorized individuals. What types of data storage devices may be accepted, types of data to be sanitized, methods of sanitization, relevant policies to ensure process effectiveness, covering both sanitization and verification of those activities. Core Requirement 7 also requires a written data security policy and includes the need to assign a data protection representative. I have this capitalized because it's a defined term within the standard. Risk of theft as well as unauthorized access are to be considered within the security program under R2V3 Core Requirement 7 as well. Core 7 requires different levels of security permissions for controlled access, and these will be relevant to the types of equipment received, nature of data managed, any applicable legal requirements or other requirements. If you have a customer that requires additional security, this would be included as well. All of this is to go through the data protection representative. Written acknowledgements are to be maintained for those granted security. An incident response procedure for investigating potential or actual breaches is also required. And demonstration of 100% effectiveness of the destruction practices is required. Devices may be shipped or transferred for data destruction to a downstream vendor if there's a written contract in place, and if that downstream vendor has been vetted or verified according to Appendix A, which we'll talk about later. Appendix A focuses on the downstream recycling chain. So again, if the R2 facility is not conducting that sanitization or destruction in-house, they're sending it to a downstream vendor who's been verified against those same requirements, so that no matter who's conducting those activities, the R2V3 requirements are met. It requires annual internal data security and sanitization audits to validate those data sanitization processes, and this needs to be performed by a competent and independent auditor. This is another key change in R2V3 when we compare R2 2013 to the new standard. Core Requirement 4 focuses on focus materials. It includes requirements to demonstrate the recycling chain's expertise, capacity, planned methods, and capabilities needed to process the focus materials. It also requires a downstream recycling chain flowchart when the R2 facility is not the final point of processing. So you can find these requirements also in Appendix A, downstream recycling chain, inclusive of international movements through final disposition or through the first R2V3 certified tier. Everywhere you see R2 certified or R2 facility in the R2V3 standard, they are referring to the R2V3 standard, not R2 2013. R2 2013 is not recognized or accepted in the R2V3 standard. Alkaline batteries not containing mercury would be managed under Core Requirement 2. This is different than R2 2013. On the other hand, even lead-free circuit boards are considered focus materials in R2V3. So those are some differences between R2 2013 and R2V3 once again. Excuse me. Indoor processing is required, except in instances where outdoor operations have been assessed for risk and release potential. Indoor storage and labeling is also required, except for items that are intended for outdoor use. Insurance coverage is to be appropriate given risk, size, and scope of operations. The closure plan is to include appropriate commercial businesses to manage any electronics that are left under their control at the time of closure. A key difference between R2 2013 and R2V3 is possible exemption from the need to hold a financial instrument to cover closure costs. An R2 facility would need to meet all three of these requirements to qualify. Those include closure costs totaling less than 10,000 US dollars, a building sized less than 1,000 square meters, and that the R2 facility never accepts equipment or materials containing mercury, CRT glass, lithium primary batteries, or polychlorinated biphenyls. So again, all three of these requirements need to be met in order for an R2 facility to qualify for this exemption. The last of the 10 core requirements focuses on transport. Packaging for transportation needs to be secure and meet core requirement 7 requirements, as well as core requirement 4 requirements as applicable. If data containing equipment or components is to be transported, there are additional requirements such as security and packaging controls, contracts with transporters, tracking of shipments, etc. Core Requirement 10 requires accurate codes, descriptions, and declarations in compliance with both regulatory requirements and standard requirements for those shipping documents and transportation labels. The second half of the standard represents the process requirements or the appendices, and again, these are identified as applicable based on an R2 facility's specific activities, processes, and scope. Appendix A covers downstream recycling chain. This is where we find requirements for the focus material management plan, due diligence requirements, again, making a distinction between R2V3 tiers and non-R2 tiers, which would include anyone who is still R2 2013 certified, verification of import and export legality, tracking to the first R2V3 tier or to final disposition. You have the opportunity to register the downstream flow with SIRI in order to have less tracking, not less due diligence, but less tracking. This appendix also requires transparent communication regarding the recycling chain to suppliers. Appendix A will apply to the majority of downstream vendors unless you are the end of the road, end of life facility through Appendix E. Again, there's a distinction between R2V3 certified downstream vendors and non-R2V3 certified downstream vendors. If you are utilizing an R2V3 certified Tier 1 downstream vendor, the required due diligence is minimal. It includes confirming the certificate is active and valid. That means not expired, not suspended, current, etc. That the name and address match the facility to which you're sending material, that the scope matches. So if you're sending batteries for recycling and their scope is limited to testing and resale of cell phones, we may have a disconnect there. So that scope makes sense, inclusive of any process requirements as applicable. For non-R2V3 downstream vendors, there are additional due diligence requirements above and beyond that R2V3 category. It's not incredibly different from the expectations in R2 2013. However, it's not recognizing that R2 2013 status. We see references to the appendices instead of the provisions in R2 2013. So some of the terminology looks different here. And we see the appendices come up under the non-R2V3 downstream vendor section of Appendix A. Again, this is where we were talking earlier regarding sending material to a downstream vendor instead of meeting that process requirement in-house. If we're talking about sanitization or destruction of data, you'll see under Appendix A for non-R2V3 downstream vendors, the expectation to verify the downstream vendor is meeting Appendix B if that is applicable to your process flow. If you are sending material to be tested, repaired, refurbished for resale purposes, then we see requirements in Appendix A to vet that non-R2V3 downstream vendor to Appendix C requirements. So by not meeting those appendices in-house, it's not a loophole to have them processed outside of the standard requirements. It just means that you're verifying the downstream vendor is meeting those requirements on behalf of the R2 facility. Appendix B covers data sanitization expectations above and beyond the core requirement 7 expectations. There are additional data sanitization expectations such as traceability, training, security controls. There is a physical destruction methods table in Appendix B. This is different than the destruction allowances or processes acceptable under Core Requirement 7. This is where we also see the logical sanitization or the wiping covered in R2V3 would be in Appendix B. Appendix B requires 60 days recording for video footage of physical destruction. It specifies data sanitization software criteria, a minimum sampling size. It requires prompt corrective action for non-conforming product. There are additional requirements for the data protection representative. And again, that's above and beyond Core Requirement 7 if it fits the scope and activities at your R2 facility. Appendix C covers test and repair. Any R2 facilities certifying to this process requirement are required to have a certified QMS. So this is one of the appendices or process requirements that would require RIOS, ISO 9001, or one of the other certified QMS standards approved by SERI. You can find that list on SERI's website. If you're eligible or required to have Appendix C and you don't already have a certified QMS, you'll be required to pursue one and add one. We will not be able to issue an R2V3 certificate before that standard has been added and audited and the certification achieved. Appendix C requires a documented R2 reuse plan. The criteria is prescriptive in nature, what needs to be included, what needs to be documented, including functionality test plans, effectiveness verification plans, the return policy, competency requirements, etc. Material needs to be processed within 1 year. It needs to be processed. They can be inventoried longer than that if they've been evaluated, confirmed to be functional, and they're being stored as repair parts, for example, but they need to be processed within 1 year of receipt. And test result records need to be maintained for all functions for each uniquely identified item. And this is a little bit more specific than R2 2013 here again. Appendix Appendix D covers specialty electronics. Any R2 facility certifying to Appendix D is also required to have Appendix C. As we just discussed on the last slide, Appendix C requires a certified QMS. So if you have D, you also need C, which means you also need to have or add a certified QMS. This section has criteria and verifications detailed in lieu of testing for those requirements associated with specialty electronics that will exceed the 1% rule covered in Core Requirement 6. This includes processing material based on whether they have passed or failed the specified verifications to be R2 controlled streams or verified specialty electronics per the rec. These can be stored indefinitely as long as they continue to have a resale value and a reuse market. Excuse me, specialty electronics under Appendix D can only be sold to an end user and need a return policy as well. Appendix E covers materials recovery. This includes additional environmental health and safety requirements above and beyond the core requirement expectations. This applies to R2 facilities performing destructive dismantling or materials recovery related activities. This can look different based on the types of focus materials and the scope of the R2 facility. But if you fall into the category of qualifying for Appendix E, the additional environmental health and safety requirements will kick in and be fulfilled by Appendix E. These include hazard and risk assessments performed on a regular basis, maintaining controls for dismantling, having appropriate pollution liability insurance, guaranteed reserves, or government guarantees to cover environmental incidents, and the evaluation of materials recovery output streams per the REC and Core Requirement 6. This will not apply to R2 facilities doing non-destructive hand dismantling. Siri has some helpful scope tools and appendix identification tools on the knowledge base to help distinguish or determine whether your facility requires Appendix E or whether the activities you're performing do not necessitate Appendix E. The final appendix is focused on brokering. This applies to both sourcing and control of equipment and materials delivered directly to a downstream vendor from the customer, as well as those that are aggregated at the broker's facility and then shipped downstream. If you are qualified to Appendix F, this is the other appendix that also requires a certified QMS, so either ISO 9001, RIOS, or one of the other quality standards will be required. Downstream vendors are still managed per Appendix A, and the brokering R2 facility is responsible for several key requirements, although in instances where the broker does not have a facility that takes physical possession of the materials, if they never pass through the broker's facility, then we don't need the certified EHS standards in this case. We would still need the certified QMS, but Core Requirement 3 and 9 would be satisfied or not be required for instances where the broker doesn't take physical possession. I'm not going to focus on the rec. I know we are going over our time and I want to make sure we get to the questions. I will go more quickly through these last couple of slides. The rec I mentioned earlier is that framework for having the categories be identified either through the exact categories in the rec or a cross-reference. Not all the categories are going to apply to all R2 facilities. And any statuses per the rec assigned by an R2 facility can be accepted by other R2 facilities. Again, we're talking R2V3 when we say R2 facilities. These categories are not meant to replace descriptions that are required for a variety of reasons. There's table 1 in the rec that's helpful in directing the processing of materials based on their condition and their status. There's R2 controlled streams, unrestricted streams, and then the data sanitization statuses. Again, whether we are sure that the data has already been resolved or if it is still unknown, to ensure no data is being uncontrolled. There are functioning product categories, including cosmetic descriptions, product functionality descriptions, and these can be utilized directly or through a cross-reference. Some additional requirements for clients who are preparing to be audited to R2V3. One key change is the contract validation process. So I want to mention this briefly before we move on. The contract validation is an activity that PJR conducts off-site prior to your R2V3 audit, and it fulfills a number of requirements in the Code of Practice. For a Stage 1 client, it fulfills both the readiness review requirements in the Code of Practice, as well as some additional requirements that also apply to R2V3 transition clients. So you'll have that contract validation to, for example, review the legal entity names to make sure the contract is correct, since this is something that is specified in R2V3. It also covers the ability to confirm and review the appendices have been reasonably correctly identified. These, of course, are confirmed again during the audits when an auditor is able to get familiar with your processes and see your facility, whether on-site or virtually. The contract validation is an off-site activity, but it is still a valuable tool to confirm a lot of the eligibility requirements for those R2V3 audits. And the closer we get to accurate appendices, the less likely it is that the audit time will change once the audit process begins. So that is value added. It allows, the Code of Practice also allows for up to one surveillance audit to be conducted virtually. We are getting into the cycle where some of our initial registration clients who had their Stage 1 and Stage 2s last year are entering their first surveillance cycle. So we can still do one of the two surveillance audits virtually per the Code of Practice. The Code of Practice also for R2V3 introduces different schemes. We no longer have multi-site sampling for R2V3. So within the Code of Practice, you'll see the different scheme options depending on how your organization is structured and how it interrelates with other locations or other facilities. This is something that we work through the application process as well as the contract validation. Another key change with R2V3 is the requirement for all NCRs written against the R2V3 standard to have revisits to verify effective closure of the corrections and corrective actions. It also stipulates timeframes for those deadlines. Evidence of correction is due within 60 days. Within 90 days, the revisit and evidence of corrective action implementation are due. And those are things that your auditor will review with you in more detail should any NCRs be identified. For clients pursuing initial certification, I want to go through what that process looks like just at a really high level, and then we'll get to any questions that you guys may have. The first step, as always, is to get a copy of the standard to understand and be able to reference what the requirements are. You'll want to establish your system documentation to meet the standard requirements, conduct any training required by the standard, implement the standard requirements, including before your R2V3 audits, your internal audit, your compliance evaluation, and a management review. You'll need a contract with a certification body such as PJR to perform those audits, as well as submit any pre-qualification information required. This, for example, would include the contract validation process. We do have some documentation or clarifications that are requested in preparation for that activity. After successful completion of the contract validation, you'll complete your Stage 1 audit, which is primarily a documentation review, and the Stage 2 audit, which is the full system sampling for effectiveness in meeting the standard requirements audit. We'll talk about those a little bit more on the next slide. Should any nonconformities be issued, they do need to be fully addressed before a certificate can be issued. I did already mention the code of practice requirements for those timelines for closing NCRs. The contract validation is an offsite activity typically scheduled between a quarter day and a half day. Stage 1 audits are documentation reviews to ensure the organization's readiness for Stage 2. Any R2V3 NCRs identified at Stage 1 need to be fully resolved before the Stage 2 audit can proceed. Stage 2 audits are inclusive of the entire management system. As I mentioned earlier, any NCRs need to be fully resolved before a certificate can be issued. And the code of practice requires that all R2V3 Stage 2 time be completed on site. There is not an allowance for the Stage 2 audit to be conducted virtually. Once a certificate is issued, it's good for 3 years. You have 2 subsequent years of surveillance audits, whether annual or semi-annual. You've got those 2 years worth of surveillance cycles. The 3rd year in the cycle constitutes the recertification audit, which is very similar to a Stage 2 audit in that it covers the entire management system and results in a new 3-year certificate once any NCRs have been resolved. I know I went through that pretty quickly. Please feel free to type in any questions that you may have and we can discuss them further. In the meantime, I'm going to put my contact information up on the slide. Should there be any technical questions best addressed outside of a webinar forum, you can contact me by phone or email. I've also included the sales department information should you be looking for a quote and to get started on scheduling your audits with PJR. Again, a recording of today's webinar and a copy of the slides will be made available on PJR's website in the next couple of days. Okay, I don't see any questions yet, but I will hang out for another minute or two. Let's see. Okay, here's one. Does the R2V3 have a lead auditor certification course? Yes, this is offered through CIRI. This is not something that certification bodies are able to offer. CIRI manages that process. So through the CIRI website, you can find dates for lead auditor certifications. Again, this is something offered not just to certification body auditors, but there are trainings for, or training availability also for internal auditors, consultants, management representatives, anyone who wants to learn more about the standard. Those trainings would be offered through CIRI's website. Again, I'll hang out for another minute or two to see if anyone is typing. Otherwise, thank you so much for attending today's webinar. If you've got your transition audit or initial registration audit to R2V3 coming up, I wish you the best of luck. I hope today's webinar is helpful. Feel free to reference previous versions of the webinar. We offer this close to monthly, so if you've got your transition audit scheduled and you want to check back, feel free to tune into a future webinar as well on the subject, or review any other webinars that we have on the PJR website, both previously recorded and upcoming. There are no more questions, so I'm going to log off. Thank you so much for attending today. Feel free to reach out via email or phone should you have any other additional questions, and good luck with your upcoming R2V3 audit. Thank you.